Welcome to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast. Your chance to learn about the teachings of the Catholic Church on sacred music, both in theory and practice. Through interviews, discussions, and music, your hearts and minds will be lifted up and better understand what it means to sing the praise of His glory. And now, your hosts, Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson.
Hi, listeners, and welcome. Today we'll be interviewing the composer Kevin Allen, a man who has dedicated his life to creating beautiful music, often in the service of the Church in the liturgy. While he's written operas and oratorios, today we'll be discussing the large body of sacred music that he's written and how his faith has influenced his compositions. Kevin, it's great to have you on the show.
Thank you for asking me.
Of course, yeah. I want to start off today by asking you a bit about your background as a composer and how your Catholic faith has influenced you. I guess particularly if there's any experiences that you had as a child or as a youth growing up that were particularly formative for you.
Absolutely. Well, as many of your listeners may know, I was born in Chicago, and I still am based in Chicago. And historic Bronzeville, which is a very a neighborhood well known for producing lots and lots of musicians. And I actually was in the parish of Holy Angels parish and school. Actually, I lived on the block of Holy Angels, so I only had to walk just a few doors down to go to the school and to the church. Our music education was actually the people in charge of our music education were the School Sisters of St. Francis, who were based in Milwaukee. And they formed the nucleus of the faculty. And these women just worked tirelessly. And I think they were just, filled with love, because they were really strict and really strong. But I think all of the students, we felt really cared for and really safe with these people. I mean, we had, for instance, the school was very traditional. So, I had the Baltimore Catechism. That was our text for catechism. And Sister Marilyn would come around to each classroom with a little box of prizes, who could answer the questions, who made us, who is God, why did God make us, and all of that.
Right.
And, for so many right answers, you would get, a little statuette, either Our Lady of Lourdes or Infant of Prague, or for the girls, a pink rosary, and for the boys, a blue rosary. So it was just so much fun. And those are memories that I've always kept with me and really carried to my life today.
That's great. That's really beautiful.
For instance, I actually have a statue of Infant of Prague. I mean, not a little plastic one from Sister Marilyn, but I think a chalk statue, with actual clothes, like a faux silk,
right.
Gown and the crown was missing. So I convinced my mother to buy it. It was, maybe half off because the crown was missing. I went home, made the crown, and put it very prominently on my dresser. I was probably maybe 15 or 16, long after the influence of Sister Marilyn. And to go to today, 2016, I was actually in Prague and able to see the actual Infant of Prague in Prague. And I trace that all the way back to Sister Marilyn's, education in the Baltimore Catechism. So these things are all connected.
Yeah, that's incredible.
It's wonderful.
Your choral music is such a delight to sing, Kevin, and to listen to. A few months back, I was asking some of my students what they would like to sing for a particular occasion, and they answered anything by Kevin Allen. And one of the things I and my choirs love so much about your music is the smoothness of the lines and the voices, and each line is interesting and it's fun to sing, and the harmonies are beautiful. It often strikes me as a Palestrina-like smoothness, but with modern harmonies. Who are some of the composers that have most profoundly influenced your writing?
Let's see. I would say Bruckner, absolutely, for the intensity and the way he sets text. Just there's this profundity and solidity in Bruckner that I've always loved, and the sonority that he's able to build, and the lush harmonies. From just the very minimal ideas, he can build this great edifice. After Bruckner, I would have to say, actually going backward in time, Lassus, just for the sheer beauty, variety, and strangeness. Sometimes he'll have this line, and then two bars later, he's in a different mode for just a moment, and then he'll go back. So I really enjoy Lassus for that. And an early composer that I, even before Lasse was going again back in time, would be Johannes Ockeghem, which I studied Ockeghem intently in my late teens and early 20s. It was slightly nerdy, I guess. But I just love his sense of long line and his non-imitative counterpoint, which is not something that we learn about or focus very much on. And we talk about imitative counterpoint all the time, but it's rare that we spend any time studying the aspects of non-imitative counterpoint. And so I always found that fascinating, as well as his liberation of the bass line in music. And so I've always tried to write for true basses, and I also, in that same idea of giving interest, to give great interest to the alto line. I really favor the altos quite a bit.
And I'm sure they appreciate that too.
They do. They tell me.
Well, great. Well, we're going to dive right into listening a piece of yours, Hodie Shietis, the introit for the Mass of Christmas Vigil. The text, I'll read it beforehand. Here it is. Today you will know that the Lord is coming to save us, and tomorrow you will see his glory. The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof, the world and all those who dwell therein. Kevin, right before we listen to this, can you describe this piece a little bit?
Yes. With every liturgical text, and certainly my church music can say it's primarily liturgical, I always think of the moment at the Mass when this could be sung. So, of course, this could be used as a proper or a motet. But if used as a proper, and I always begin in the place where I find it in the liturgy, I think, what is the action that's going? And then I get underneath the text. And so I just think about today, this dawning of salvation coming on earth, God made man.
Great. All right. Well, here we go.
So when people think of modern or contemporary music, they often think of pop music, products of American culture and driven by the music industry, or maybe they think of classical music that's super complex to understand or rather ugly, or maybe they think of things composed for the sacred liturgy in this contemporary style, quote unquote contemporary style. And they think of things that are common compositions put out by many of the mainline liturgical publishing houses in the U.S. Your music isn't really like any of those things. And our listeners might not be aware of other composers or compositions that likewise don't fit those categories. When you think of really great choral music in the modern time, what do you think of? Or when you think of composers who are really great at composing for amateur church choirs, who do you think of?
Well, first, I'd like to say pop music, I think I can say without any controversy, is certainly out of place at formal worship. I mean, you wouldn't really know that by what the mainstream publishers are publishing. As you mentioned, academic music or conservatory music, I think those in the conservatory are really uninterested in providing music for the church, or if they are, what they're providing isn't appropriate. And I can't say that I know much of it. But with the publications of these mainline publishers, I think the disservice they've done to church music is something for which they really, really have to answer for at some point. But, I mean, in fairness to them, they seem to have customers, and they seem to stay in business, so something is amiss. And that perhaps could be another show or interview altogether, which I think would be very beneficial. Good choral music, I think, is happening. Most of it tends to be secular or profane, and or just religious, so it's just not appropriate for liturgies, either because of length or performing forces, and generally it's not, I would say, not liturgical. But there have been some composers, I should say, at least the composers that I know, Richard Hillard, Carl Schock, Bartolucci, who I think was a cardinal, and Nicola Montani. Now, only one of those men that I could just think of offhand is still alive, and that's also a problem because these names, I think, should roll off our tongues, but I don't think the composers are being performed. So I think it's something we should reach out to churches, in particular cathedrals, or churches with professional or semi-professional choirs. Somehow we have to encourage them to do more music of composers that are with us. For instance, I think that there's an Anglican church in Chicago that I'm on their music list far more than our cathedral or any other Catholic church in Chicago, which just seems bizarre. I mean, the last time any music of mine, I could be wrong. If I am wrong, someone please correct me. But I think the last time any piece of mine was done at our cathedral in Chicago was under Richard Prue, and that was almost 10 years ago. So, and I think his successor wanted to perform actually that mass. A mass was commissioned and was performed under Dr. Prue. And his successor wanted to do it, and he couldn't find it in the music library. So I think that also could be another problem, or at least something that we should discuss at another show. A whole show could be devoted to how do we get our churches and cathedrals to perform this new music, to encourage new composers.
Kevin, I guess kind of related to that, I'm wondering what you think of the music of Arvo Pärt. I know he's very well known. I guess liturgically, one of the difficulties is that it's hard to have a parish choir that can perform any works by him. But as a fellow composer, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on his music.
I think a lot of his music is very beautiful. I'm not sure what he is thinking when he's writing his music. For sure, let's say we mentioned Bruckner, or even those four men that I mentioned, they knew that they were writing church music. They were writing it for choirs to perform Sunday in and Sunday out. I'm not sure if I never knew Pärt personally. I'm not sure if that's his focus, if this music was meant for recordings or meant for concerts. So while some of it can be done in churches, actually I know churches in Chicago that perform his Berliner Messe, Berliner Messe, and another piece of his, I can't think of the name right now. But I'm not really sure that he would consider himself a church musician in that sense. Just as people often mention Messiaen, and Messiaen has only one liturgical piece of music, and that's the O Sacrum. Other than that, he's really, really a secular composer.
That's a really interesting perspective, yeah, because I guess he is really known in the choral world. It's more on the secular realm and universities and choral societies rather than the parishes, tend to, or, even in movies, he was in,
Exactly.
his music is used in Gravity and other movies as well.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Shifting back to your compositions, I've noticed that you've set a lot of Eucharistic texts, texts that are well known, like the Panis Angelicus, but then also some more obscure and really beautiful Eucharistic texts that are perhaps more unique. Could you talk from your personal spiritual side of the setting of liturgical music, I guess particularly Eucharistic texts, because it seems that you have a particular passion in that regard, for the service of the Mass, and how you kind of go about that process, if you're feeling inspired by reading sacred poetry or prayers or...
Well, absolutely. This is a very easy and a question near and dear to my heart. When I compose music or even think about writing church music, it begins and ends with the Mass. As we all know, and as we've been told so often, that the holy sacrifice of the Mass is the ne plus ultra of our Catholic practice. So, of course, Eucharistic texts highlight the sacrificial nature of the Mass rather than the, one could say, questionable focus on the agape, which, however laudable that might be, it's really not what the sacrifice of the Mass is. And so I think beginning in my early ideas about what I would do to compose for our church's liturgy, I wanted to highlight that because even though I never really was in a situation where I had to perform sacral pop, I've been very, very fortunate in my professional work to be at churches where I was not asked to do that. Well, perhaps I just avoided those jobs. However you want to look at it, I've not had to do that music, but I do notice that my colleagues have to perform music that really is for sure unliturgical, and if they do choose sacred or religious texts, most often religious texts, they tend not to be about the sacrifices. If there's some slight embarrassment about the real presence, because when you talk about the sacrifice and the real presence, that all goes together. And then after that, there also seems to be this fear of writing music, for Our Lady, which is after Eucharistic texts. I would say texts for our Blessed Virgin would come second. So I thought, well, if they're not going to do it, I'm certainly going to concentrate on those texts.
We'd like to listen now to one of your settings of O Sacrum Convivium, which is such a beautiful text and one that I love profoundly, especially thinking of the setting you just mentioned by Olivier Messiaen. The text is, O sacred banquet, wherein Christ is received. The memorial of his passion is renewed. The soul is filled with grace, and a pledge of future glory is given to us. Could you tell us a little bit about your setting here?
Well, as you mentioned earlier, I've set so many Eucharistic texts and set them so often that this text is so dear to my heart, mostly because of other settings. And I've been inspired by all the settings that I've created, that others have created. And so I sought to create a different idea or a different facet, meditating on that text. So as you mentioned, Messiaen, I thought of him, and I thought of Lassus and the other composers who've composed such beautiful texts. And I thought I would add yet my voice to this great chorus.
We have a recording here from the choir of the oratory at St. Francis de Sales in St. Louis, Missouri, and it's under the direction of Nick Botkins.
All right, Kevin, here's a question I often like to ask the people we interview. What advice would you give to someone, similar in your situation? So, say an aspiring composer who wants to use their gifts and talents to write beautiful sacred music for the church, and especially music that can be sung by church choirs, the average church or school choir.
The first thing that I would say that could be done, rather than speak to the composer, I would first speak to their teachers and their parents. First, try not to educate them to death or educate them into submission, but show them, like those wonderful school sisters of St. Francis, show by example, show through love of the liturgy. If you want your children to speak well, then speak well at home. If you want them to eat with good table manners in a restaurant, well, do that at home as well. Don't wait until you get to the restaurant and see how appalled you are and others around you, and then you beat them up for eating poorly when you eat like a slob at home. So the same thing I would say to young composers. Do things well from the beginning. Read good books. Acquaint yourself with great literature. Read Shakespeare, Flannery O'Connor, Dickens. Be familiar with beauty in all the arts. Observe fine architecture. Go to art galleries. These things inform you with a life of beauty. See the beauty in all things. And I think that inform your composition. Often, we have a very fine art museum. Actually, I was there today, the Art Institute of Chicago. I'll go and look at some paintings and be very, very inspired to compose after being refreshed by that beauty. And once you have this world of beauty in your head and in your experience, I think that greatly helps what you can do compositionally. Also, I would ask that churches help young composers by doing their music. I wouldn't suggest experimenting with untried composers, but those composers can actually have their friends sing pieces. I once had a friend, a colleague, who's having a birthday. In order to know the repertoire, one has to sing the repertoire. So for her birthday, after all the celebrations, we passed out music and we sang Bach's Lobe den Herrn as the motet Lobe den Herrn. We sang some other pieces I can't remember, but the culmination of this evening, we sang cover to cover the Fore Requiem, probably about 3 a.m. So we had maybe six or seven musicians around the piano, and I had a few extra copies of the Requiem. So I would say to these composers, even if you can't sing your compositions in a church, do it after a party. I remember as a young person, maybe 19 or 20 years old, being introduced to the Lamentations of Jeremiah by Thomas Tallis. First time I ever sang the piece. But I sang it at a party. It was a summer party. There was lots of food. It was a potluck. And one of our colleagues passed out a bunch of music, and it was the Tallis. I fell in love with that piece. That's a really great way to learn the repertoire, not just by recordings, but actually singing the music. So I would greatly suggest that you get underneath the repertoire, see what others have done, and also try out your compositions that way before you give them to the local choir master. Unfortunately, if you have a choir, fortunately, if you have a choir, use simple pieces on your choir. Find out what can be done. But I would also caution not to give things to your choir that are beyond them, or things that might try the patience of your priest or congregation.
Well, thank you, Kevin. That's great advice. I appreciate that.
So to end with, we have a third recording that I made with the seminarians of St. Joseph's Seminary at Dunwoody, where I teach. It's a setting of the Domine non sum dignus, that text, Lord, I am not worthy that you should enter under my roof, that we say right before we receive communion. So even though they're not professional singers, because your writing is so excellent, they're able to produce a lovely sound. Could you talk a little bit about this set of compositions for equal voices and how they fit with a non-professional choir?
Yes. I composed those pieces when I was choir master at St. Gregory Choir School. It was a professional men, but the boys sang the soprano part, and they had professional altos, tenors, and basses. More often than not, the boys sang alone without the men, because the men were music directors and organists in their own right. So I had to find pieces that the boys could sing alone. And also there's this third part that I used for our changing voices. Traditionally in boy choirs, when boys start to have a voice break, they were thrown out. There's some very famous stories of Haydn. He was I think a young teen, and finally, he could no longer sing in the I think St. Stephen's Cathedral in Vienna, so he had to find his way another way. So instead of throwing my boys out, I would test their voices to find the best parts of their range, and then write that tertius part so that they could sing it. And then, of course, the trebles would sing the upper two parts, and the boys with changing voices would still be able to participate. And of course, with boys, you have to keep their attention. And if you give them a steady diet of very fine literature and beauty, they expect that certainly from their choir master. So you have to give them something interesting to keep them out of mischief and also to make it a joyful experience.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Kevin. It was really lovely to hear your music and to hear more about the things that inspire you so much.
It was my pleasure. I look forward to the next time.
All right. Thanks, Kevin. Have a good one. I'm not a composer, but I always enjoy hearing artists share their advice and encouragement. Their passion for their craft always seems to rub off on me a bit, even if what I do is very different. I hope that was the same for you today. But if you are a composer, I hope you have found this episode particularly inspiring. I think Kevin is a really great example for integrating Catholic spirituality and high artistic integrity for people today.
If you've enjoyed this episode, please share it with someone who you think would enjoy it as well. Be sure to check out the upcoming events section on our website too, sacredmusicpodcast.com. There you'll find information about summer sacred music course offerings at the graduate level at St. Joseph Seminary in Yonkers, New York, as well as information about other regional and national sacred music workshops. We'll see you next time on Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast.
We hope you've enjoyed listening to Square Notes, the Sacred Music Podcast with Peter Carter and Dr. Jennifer Donaldson. For more information about this episode, sacred music resources, or upcoming events, visit our website at sacredmusicpodcast.com. You can subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, YouTube, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. If you enjoy our podcast, please write us a review on iTunes. This improves our iTunes ranking and helps others find out about the podcast. The music you heard at the beginning of this episode is Hec Dies by William Byrd, sung by the London Oratory's Schola Cantorum Boys Choir, directed by Charles Cole, from the CD Sacred Treasures of England. The music at the conclusion of this podcast is the first movement of Trio Sonata No. 6 in G major by Johann Sebastian Bach, performed by Peter Carter. We look forward to having you join us next time, and until then, may we sing the praise of His glory.